off we go with more rats, rats, rats.
Welcome to an episode of 781 News Debrief. This is the December 2024 edition. I'm your host, Jamie, and I'm here with Tom, and I'm here with Saul. Starting us off, Tom is going to talk to us a bit about the MBTA Communities Act, which just passed right at the end of this year's last session. Tom, you want to take it away?
Yeah, for sure. So the big debate going into this month was basically Waltham's old plan to comply with the MBTA Communities Act did not meet the muster according to the state. Waltham only legalized like a third of the amount of housing they were required to under state law. So the law department went back to the drawing board and they came back with two revised plans. One which would allow for 4-unit buildings with small setbacks, and another that would allow for 8-unit buildings with small setbacks. And both these plans would only have a parking minimum of one parking spot per unit, which was a very big win and very happy about. Basically, there was a big public input hearing on December 16th for this plan, and there was a really strong showing for the 8-unit plan. Very proud, I worked with Waltham Inclusive Neighborhoods to show out with big support for the more pro-housing plan. And yeah, we had, I think, like 24, 25 speakers in support of the 8-unit plan, as well as like dozens of emails. In return, there was only one speaker at the event that was in support of less housing. But the unfortunate thing is, at the end of the day, public input doesn't vote on the plan. City councilors do. And unfortunately, the two ward councilors for the areas affected by MBTA Communities Act zoning, Ward 4 Councilor John McLaughlin and Ward 7 Councilor Paul Katz, were very strongly against more housing in their neighborhoods. They wanted low density as possible, absolute minimum. And they both supported the 4-unit plan, which the mayor had put forward in order to counteract the 8-unit plan that Ordinance and Rules Committee had passed 2 weeks prior. So with John McLaughlin and Paul Katz going against the more pro-housing plan, that was enough to sway Karen Dunn, who, even though she appeared to endorse the pro-housing arguments, she wanted to respect the ward councilor's wishes. As a ward councilor, she switched her vote. And that, in addition to Kathy Ann Harris not voting as the chair, ended up being a 3-1 vote in favor of reducing the MBTA Communities Act plan from 8-unit buildings to 4-unit buildings. And that should be said, it's a maximum. The 8-unit building plan would have allowed for both 8 units and 4-unit buildings. What the city council voting for the 4-unit plan means is that it is straight up illegal to build anything denser than 4 units per building. Which is a shame because buildings greater than 4 units is exactly what already exists in these neighborhoods. Specifically, the only residential housing that is included within the overlay district is Charles Bank and Edgewater Terrace, both of which are multifamily communities in Ward 7 that are exclusively made up of apartment residents who live in buildings larger than 4 units. So that level of sort of like hostility and fear towards legalizing the type of homes that already exist in these neighborhoods was certainly very disappointing. But the end result is there is still progress, especially comparing to only a few months ago. There's a plan for more housing, or at least legalizing more housing, even though the construction of this housing probably won't be economically feasible. But there's more housing, there's lower parking minimums, and these are two very big wins over the past year of improving housing affordability and like pushing towards zoning reform in the city of Waltham.
One of the things that struck me attending that meeting was that you had easily 20 something people all showing in to say what they wanted as constituents. And when they came to the discussion of the meeting, they're in the ordinance and rules meeting after, the McLaughlin cited the stuff that he had talked about in the pre-meeting before any of the public input even came in, very much rooted in sort of keeping things the way they are and appealing to sort of a vague dislike of these things and hinting at the people there more than anything. And I was rewatching some of that coverage of some of them discussing this, and one of the things Kate's mentioned was specifically sort of the amount of trash generated in 8-unit buildings and stuff like that, and like
complex. I have plenty of 8-unit buildings. I have plenty of 4-unit buildings. I could barely tell them apart. I've lived in a 4-unit building. I've lived next to an 8-unit building. I will say that even renting in a 4-unit building, like I did for years, we were the residents. We were all very close, and we still keep in touch with each other 20 years later. I had great landlords. There were 2 different sets of landlords. We were all close. Next door to us was an 8-unit property. It wasn't quite the same camaraderie, if you will, sense of neighborliness. I also, when I drive by the 8 units and on trash day and I see the barrels out, it's kind of a mess. It's just like a lot of barrels out on the sidewalk that I feel you don't see in front of the 4 units. But going back to the appealing aspect, I think that the 4 units are more, if we're trying to attract people to the city and keep them in the city, whichever it is, I find the 4 units are more appealing. 4-unit properties are more appealing to them. It's a little bit more at scale. It provides some more open space.
I lived in a 7-unit building for over a decade, and they do not generate that much trash. It's like they are sort of projecting all of this onto the density of the building and then trying to include something about the people that live there, and it's not great. I took more a little bit of offense to is the whole idea that you don't know your neighbors living in any of these, like in a high density thing too. And Kate's saying that like he felt he knew his neighbors more in a 4-unit versus an 8-unit. And again, like I knew all my neighbors in my 7-unit building, and there's nothing saying that, like it's I guess it's a question of participation. And I mean, like the place I live at now, I don't really know my neighbors, and it's a 2-unit, so it's not really it feels very anecdotal to then be making policies about like how it's going to affect the neighborhood based on their personal experiences living in things versus 20-something people saying otherwise. One of the things that McLaughlin mentioned when he was talking about this too was the that as long as they're meeting the requirement, it's okay. And it just sort of shows they're just sort of trying to do the bare minimum to satisfy the state. And he even mentioned that he wasn't opposed to the idea of reducing parking minimums. He was annoyed that the state was dictating it more than anything else.
Ward 9 Councilor had mentioned the Edison. The Edison's very close to the train station. The difference that I see is when we made a decision to reduce parking, that was our decision. That wasn't the state telling us you can only have 1 space. And to me, there's a difference there.
So the parking in the MBTA Communities Act overlay districts, the parking minimum is 1 spot per housing unit as opposed to 2 in the rest of the city, which means a developer has to provide at least 1, but could provide more if they so chose. Do you know if the geometry of like this space allocated in these 2 overlay districts is such that if a developer wanted to provide more than 1, that we would still be able to be in compliance, like meeting those 4,000 however many units? Or is the assumption that a developer is only going to provide 1?
Like Waltham does receive a more generous unit calculation when they reduce the amount of parking. And the parking model does presume 1 parking spot per unit, but also it's an impossible thing to calculate exactly, and it's relatively it's relatively conservative in the or actually relatively liberal in the amount of space it assumes cars require. So basically, the way it's calculated in the state's models is that if there is a parking minimum of 2 parking spots per unit, then that means they assume that 65% of all the buildable land area has to be set aside, has to be dedicated towards parking, and thus only the remaining 35% of land area actually goes to the calculation of how the buildings and how many units are in those buildings. And for the parking minimum of 1 spot per unit, then their assumption goes from 65% of the buildable land area being committed towards parking to 40% of the buildable land area being committed towards parking. So that's the change in the calculations. Is essentially by reducing the parking minimums from 2 unit to 1 unit, suddenly the amount of the land area that actually goes towards housing increases from 35% of the land area to 60% of the land area. So it essentially, by lowering the parking minimum from 2 to 1, in the state's calculations, it almost doubles the amount of expected unit capacity. And that's how the math works.
Okay, but it's possible. So as long as the zoning allows for the 4,000 or so units, we're okay, even if developer came in and said, we're gonna provide 3 spots, which effectively reduces the number of housing. Because the zoning allows for 4,000, then we're in compliance. If I
Correct.
understand it. Okay.
Correct.
One of the reasons why, like, they specifically said that they're setting this like land aside where they picked is because it's already developed industrial land that would be unlikely to get developed in the future. So it's kind of like they're both getting to fearmonger about what could happen as the worst case scenario, but then they've already taken steps to make sure that it's going to be very difficult for that to actually happen in any reasonable time frame. So it's kind of like, I think that's kind of like why it's confusing to people, because it doesn't really make sense the way that they're talking about it sometimes. So, because they're acting like the sky is falling, when in reality, it's probably going to continue to be an office building for a while, even if they pass it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it definitely seems to
100%.
be
Like
confused.
if
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
no, just 100%. If the law department saw their goal as to zone for 4,000 units of housing, while also almost guaranteeing that as little housing as possible will actually get built, they succeed in that goal. The extreme restrictions of only being able to build buildings as large as 4 units per building is incredibly restrictive in terms of what developers are allowed to build, especially when working with large lots that are already occupied with current uses. It is not, I'm not incredibly optimistic we'll see a lot of housing development result from this, aside from a few small lots along Thayer Road in the eastern edge of Waltham.
Yeah, it's almost like the law itself, the state law itself is structured to allow municipalities to do what Waltham has done.
Yeah. And I mean, we are
Like,
under our own state.
satisfy the letter of it, but not necessarily the intention of the statute.
Yeah, the state provided an extreme amount of latitude in terms of how cities wanted to approach their compliance with this law. And every city's compliance with this law is basically a reflection of that city's values. And you have cities like Lexington, who very clearly went above and beyond and are interested in tackling this housing crisis. Same with Watertown. And we have cities like Waltham, who did 20 units away from the very bare minimum in a type of building form which is very unlikely to be built. Like it's a very clear indication, because the MBTA Communities Act gave so much flexibilities to cities and towns. You can tell by the response. Oh, okay, Watertown, very pro housing, very forward thinking in addressing their affordability and traffic crises. Waltham, not particularly forward thinking, trying to do absolute bare minimum. And then of course cities like Milton and Holton don't give a damn at all. They actively hate affordable housing. Waltham had a deadline of December 31st of this year to pass new zoning compliant with the MBTA Communities Act. Waltham is actually technically not going to meet that deadline, but regardless, they have communicated with the state, and the law department claims that the state's fine with it. We're only going to miss it by like 2 weeks. And the reason for that is Waltham has this really funny rules for its city council. How it operates is that to pass a zoning ordinance, city council has to vote on the zoning ordinance 3 different times. Which is why you'll hear things referred to as first reading, second reading, and third reading. So far, Waltham has voted on their zoning ordinance twice, 2 of the 3 times. They voted in support of passing the 4-unit plan in the first council session on December 23rd. They voted a second time in favor of the zoning amendment during the second council meeting of December 23rd, because December 23rd, as the last meeting of the year, had 2 council sessions. But city council will not have an opportunity to vote on it a third time and thus finally pass the law and send it to the mayor's desk for her signature until the first city council meeting of January, which I think is going to be like January 13th, I think. Yeah, Waltham technically hasn't finished passing its MBTA Communities Act zoning plan. It technically isn't law yet, but all indicators say they're on track. And even though they are going to technically miss the state's deadline of December 31st of this year, it's kosher, or it should be kosher.
So the rest is just a formality of third reading and mayoral blessing.
Mayor will either sign it or she'll leave it on her desk for 10 days and then it will automatically become law.
When I was rewatching the discussion on the 11th or on November 18th, I believe, One of the things that Counselor, the solicitor had mentioned was that they they might be able to change it, like if parking is a problem, they might be able to change like the parking factor after the fact. And I was sure how that would be taken by the state, or if this is something that the state would be looking for in any way.
What are the options for the city to counteract that? Do they start adding parking decks to the public parking? Is there areas to increase parking? If it is an issue, and if it's not an issue, it won't necessarily have to be addressed. Just as a concern of if it happens and if it is an issue, what would the options be?
Certainly, these are not going to all be developed on day one. If at all, this is really an exercise in us having to create the zoning, not necessarily having to build it. If some of these lots get developed and we determine that, that one parking space is not adequate, we can always revisit MBTA communities and include more area in the district and increase the parking. As long as we're meeting that density in the way that the state requires, there's no reason we couldn't go back in and tweak things in a way that, continued to have these models be compliant, but took in more land area or, made more accommodations for parking in the future.
So the parking would go up, but then the land mass would
We would
increase.
have to include much more
You're
land.
still trying to get to the same density units.
Exactly, yeah.
Understood.
So there are specific provisions in the MBTA Communities Act guidelines published by the state that say, hey, if you want to tinker with the zoning under your MBTA Communities Act compliance plan, you do have to let us know, and you do have to go through the compliance again. Like if Waltham were to like 1, 2, 5, 10, 50 years later, go back and try to increase the parking minimums of this MBTA Communities Act overlay district without doing anything else, they would suddenly fall out of compliance with the MBTA Communities Act and face the relevant consequences of doing so.
That makes sense. So they wouldn't be able to just increase the parking minimums. They'd have to like take some other concessions in the mix if they wanted to even try that.
Yes, Waltham needs to be in compliance with the MBTA Communities Act into perpetuity.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tom. Moving on to the next Tom thing, ADUs.
So yeah, on the subject of ADUs, as part of the Affordable Homes Act this past year, the state legalized the construction of tiny backyard apartments in all areas where single-family homes are allowed to be built statewide. And basically, this law takes effect February 2nd of next year. These tiny homes are called ADUs. That's what I'm going to refer to them as going forward, ADUs. And ADUs are something that Waltham currently has heavily restricted zoning to prohibit in most cases and only allow in very niche edge cases. So what this means essentially is that the state has completely overridden Waltham's old ADU laws. Because of that, Waltham is coming up with new ADU legislation that actually complies with state regulations and state law. So the law department released some new zoning language for this to comply with new state laws regarding accessory dwelling units, ADUs, backyard apartments, casitas, tiny homes, all for the same thing. And so for the most part, this is another instance similar to MBTA Communities Act, where the state takes action to allow for more housing in cities such as Waltham, and then Waltham does its best to do the bare minimum. And in the process of doing the bare minimum, Waltham has once again, or is on track to once again, fail to meet the bare minimum. Because it's very simple. Waltham just needs to legalize tiny homes in the backyards or attached or detached to any single family home in Waltham. But unfortunately, there are a few problems. So yeah, accessory dwelling unit is a unit either attached or detached from a single family home located on the same lot as a single family home. That's the definition of ADU. And notably, ADUs, as defined by state law, cannot exceed 900 square feet or 50% of the floor area of the principal single family home, whichever is smaller. Which is to say, the reason ADUs are considered an affordable housing type is because the price of homes is largely dictated by size. And smaller homes are more affordable homes. And ADUs, by definition, are small. So the first problem with Waltham's attempt to comply with this law is that they are trying to restrict the floor area of the ADU less than 600 square feet, or to be not less than 600 square feet. So it's basically saying, hey, tiny homes, they can't actually be tiny in Waltham. They're putting a floor on how small and thus how affordable these homes can be. And this violates state law for two reasons. The first reason is that this 600 square foot minimum is not something that applies to single family homes. And state law says, hey, you can't discriminate between ADUs and single family homes. If you're applying a restriction to how ADUs can be built, that same restriction better also be applied to single family homes. In this instance, this is a double standard and thus not allowed to be enforced by Waltham. The second problem, of course, is based on the definition of ADUs. You may notice that, if the maximum size of an ADU is 50% the size of the single family home, well, by setting a 600 square foot minimum size, what Waltham has done is they're effectively trying to make it illegal for anyone to build an ADU if their primary single family home is smaller than 1,200 square feet, which is the case for over 1,000 single family homeowners in Waltham. Waltham, with this provision, is trying to nullify the ability of over 1,000 homeowners in Waltham to build ADUs, and that is also illegal. Not allowed to implement policies which would nullify the abilities of homeowners to build single-family homes. This is a provision that was suggested by LeBlanc. Not too surprising, LeBlanc has what is starting to appear as a fairly solid anti-housing track record. He was similarly one of the main proponents for the reduced housing plan for the MBTA Communities Act. His prima facie, his claim defense for this sort of policy is for public health. We don't want people living in closets. However, it should be noted that the building code is what covers public health, and the building code already establishes minimum building sizes, which are based on the number of occupants. It's 150 square foot plus 100 additional square feet for every additional occupant expected in a building. So in that way, this is actually kind of a third way it violates state regulations, is that Waltham is also not allowed to implement public health zoning requirements that are more burdensome and exceed what already exists in the state building code. So those are three ways in which this specific provision violates state law, and it's going to have to be nixed. Otherwise, mostly fine.
What are
their parking minimum requirements match state law? Saul, what were you about to ask?
What are the ramifications if this were to stay as is and not be in compliance with the updated state law?
It's just straight not enforceable. People who want to build ADUs could just ignore Waltham's zoning code and build what the state says they're allowed to build. Yeah. So the thing is, the state has established that cities are allowed to implement reasonable dimensional restrictions to new ADUs built in their cities. And they did publish a list of draft regulations which define what means reasonable and unreasonable. And the three things I just listed out are things that come from the draft regulations put out by the state that say, hey, these are things you're not allowed to do, which the city of Waltham immediately tried to do. And it should be said, the state has only published their draft regulations. They don't need to have their final regulations published until February 2nd, which is when state law takes effect. So they're currently also soliciting public feedback on their state regulations as to how cities are and aren't allowed to implement ADU zoning. So state law is not finalized, but based on existing current draft regulations, Waltham is breaking the law. And thus, zoning code wouldn't be enforceable if they were to pass this. Another thing is their requirement that ADU must have separate metering for water and sewer service between the primary single-family home and the ADU. Well, of course, people who build ADUs are allowed to separately meter it. Best I can tell, that is not a requirement in state law. State law says you only have to separately meter them if you intend on separately charging the resident of the ADU for water and sewer services. If the single-family homeowner doesn't plan on separately charging the ADU tenant for water. If, for example, it's their grandma who's just living in their backyard, which is the most common example of why an ADU is important and valuable, then residents don't have to do that. And importantly, once again, state regulations state that you cannot enforce safety or utility or standards which exceed state law. And this is another example of Waltham trying to exceed state law and implementing unnecessary regulations that aren't allowed.
Yeah, I noticed when Randy had mentioned that he said something along the lines of you're not allowed to separately meter your resident or your tenant for water, but that's if they're already paying you rent, you're not allowed to then send them a bill for your water bill that you get as a landlord. You have to pay that bill or have a meter for your tenant specifically, which I thought it was not clear from how he stated that was what the reality of the law was, but when you look it up, it's like, oh, that's what he was trying to get at. And it's kind of
you said this was Randy LeBlanc.
I believe that was who'd said that, yeah.
You cannot charge a tenant for a public utility, so they would have to have their own water meter. State law.
Yeah, that might be something we want to.
And that's why we actually.
Yeah, the obnoxious thing about Randy is that he genuinely knows the building code very well. He knows it no doubt better than I do, because he is a contractor, HVAC contractor. He knows the building code very well. But he is also well documented as a bad faith anti-housing person. So he always weaponizes his knowledge to obfuscate rather than educate. He basically uses his expertise to run circles around people who don't know as much as he does, and essentially leaves out just enough information to misinform everyone who listens. He did that during the MBTA Communities Act public hearing when he was spouting bullshit about how it's actually better for developers if you restrict what they're allowed to build. And he did it, sounds like, again, in this case, where he was just misinforming people about state law and returns in terms of metering utilities.
Yeah, and at the city council, the marathon session was peppering the city solicitor with questions, asking her about fire walls and all sorts of zoning. That just seemed way out of the city solicitor about fire enunciator boxes on 4-unit versus 8-unit buildings.
You have 25% more glass on 2 4-unit buildings, or at least the natural light in between than them sandwiched still.
It's a question.
Excuse me?
It's a question. Direct the question to the end.
So in a HVAC system designed for an 8-unit building, if it was able to modulate down an example of 20%, in New England, would a HVAC unit for, if there were separate HVAC units, or if it was a large HVAC unit for 8 units, as opposed to separate ones, would it consume more electricity? And what happens when we go over 5 units?
I think anything over 3, I think, is treated the same.
Well, when it goes over 5 units, do you go to the Type 2 system, which requires probably a 6 or an 8-inch water main, and then you need an annunciator panel, and you need the fire ratings between all the petitions, and then you need the fire ratings in all the stairwells, and also when you have an 8-unit building, do you have the noise separating partitions between the buildings, which requires a 6-inch air gap and then a 2-hour fire rating, and what does that do to the cost of the building?
That's probably a question for the building department. I'm not sure that I can
And in
give an educated response to that.
In over 5 units, do you have to have an annunciator panel which is connected to the fire station?
I'm not sure.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Council.
Well, I think
And it's obnoxious because he knows so much. He could be an educational resource, but he sucks, and all he does is he uses his knowledge over others to just obfuscate and make them more confused rather than educating, which sucks.
So For ADUs, are there any ADUs in Waltham currently? I have
There
not seen
are.
one. I've seen online what they look like, but I'm not aware of any that I've seen in person in our city.
Yeah, Waltham currently has very burdensome requirements to build an ADU. It requires a special permit. You can't build it by right. You also have to have a really large home on a really large lot. It also can't be detached. It can't modify the existing building at all, which makes it damn near impossible. Like our current zoning is so restrictive to ADUs that there's technically a process to build ADUs, but only like 500 homes in all of Waltham would qualify to be able to. And some of those 500 homes have built ADUs, but it's not an easy process, and it is not a process that allows most single-family homeowners in Waltham to build an ADU, which is why Waltham's current ADU laws are bad and don't conform with state law and need to be changed in time for the February 2nd enforcement of the
So
new
under an
state law.
update, assuming that we meeting the law department does make an update that's in compliance, how does the process become easier for a homeowner that would want to do it? Like what would they not have to do going forward that they would have to do, let's say, today?
So once again, currently 90% of Waltham homeowners don't even have the option to build an ADU. Starting February 2nd, every single one should have an opportunity to build an ADU if they chose. The second big thing is that it no longer requires them going in front of city council or the ZBA and ZBA doing a whole public hearing and vote on whether they're allowed to build an ADU. Homeowners are just allowed to build an ADU. They just apply for the permit with their plans, and the permitting agency makes sure there's following the zoning and building codes. So those are the two big things. A, homeowners are actually allowed to build ADUs, and B, they don't have to go through a special permit process. They're allowed to build them by right.
Also,
And I suppose the third thing is also there are a lot fewer regulations, such as, you don't have to build 2 parking spots per ADU built. If you're close to transit, you don't have to build any. If you're far from transit, you don't have to build more than 1 parking spot.
it was also previously restricted based on the zoning to a handful of districts, I believe, before, and now it's like to anyone where there's single family housing, so basically all of them.
Yeah, it was previously only our single family zoning districts with the largest lots. Like you had to have a minimum of like 17,000 square feet or something like that. Something that like literally only like a few hundred Waltham homes meet the requirements of.
So now it's any district where single family homes are allowed to be constructed, which is pretty much almost the entire
Yeah,
city.
RA zoning, RB zoning, RC zoning, business zoning, or most business zoning. Yeah, pretty much anywhere housing can be built, ADUs would also be allowed to be built.
Right, as long as you
That's
have
reducing
the sufficient extra space to meet the requirements for a bedroom, kitchen, bathroom, etc.
Yes, but actually, but also attached ADUs are allowed as well. So if you want to like subdivide a section of your house and turn that into an ADU, you would be allowed to do that as well. So theoretically, because of that ability to build attached ADUs as well as detached ADUs, literally anyone who owns a single family home, if they wanted to, could set aside a part of their existing house to create a separate home if they wanted to do so.
Right. And often the intention of these is like not strangers, but extended family or grandparents that could now have their own space, but be very close to their family.
That's certainly the most compelling and the most common need and reason people build ADUs. But notably, there is also no owner occupancy requirement, meaning like if someone wanted to rent out their ADU to strangers, or if someone wanted to move away but continue renting out their ADU to strangers, they would be allowed to do so. It allows for a lot more flexibility. So, there is the benefit of providing a living space for grandparents and relatives and whatnot, but it's not the only use that will be allowed. Yeah.
Cool. Be curious to see how many of these actually end up getting built and how homeowners even find out that these changes are happening in the first place.
Yeah. No, I'm optimistic about it, especially because there are existing homeowners who have tried to build ADUs in Waltham. And I, as a person who receives emails for Waltham and those neighborhoods, I have received emails from total strangers who have been like, hey, I tried to build ADU, city shut me down. how do I move forward? And I've just been telling them, hey, wait 6 months, and pretty soon it will be legal for you to build an ADU, which is nice and good. I will say the only big restriction on occupancy that the state has allowed cities to implement, in which Waltham does plan on implementing, is a ban on short-term rentals, which is to say ADUs will not be allowed to be turned into Airbnbs or only rented out for a few weeks at a time. It will have to be for long-term rentals, meaning like college students still, but nothing more transient than college students. It would have to be long-term rental contracts.
I think part of the silver lining here is also that, like, because they got rid of the zoning on it being only the largest lot sizes, most of those large lots were nowhere near public transit, and now any of the stuff that gets developed, it's a good chance it'll be somewhere closer to transit at least.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah. But yeah, back to Waltham's plan on implementing their ADU law, though. A third way they're violating state law is that Waltham is attempting to limit the height of detached ADUs to only 1 story tall, which once again is illegal for a reason that has been discussed, which is that you are not allowed to apply double standards between ADUs and single family homes. As I think everyone intuitively knows, single family homes in Waltham are allowed to be up to 2.5 stories high. And therefore, Waltham is not allowed to limit ADUs to be anything than 2.5 stories high. Will most single-family homeowners choose to build ADUs that are only 1 story high because it's most convenient? Obviously, yes. But if single-family homeowners want to build ADUs that are as tall as single-family homes, Waltham is not allowed to prohibit that.
Yeah, I'm guessing that, right, in practicality or in reality, like if it's a relatively small plot, making it 2nd stories, you're eating up half your space in staircases. That makes it a lot less practical.
Mm-hmm.
But at least it would be permissible now.
Yeah, those are the main ways Waltham's zoning plan violates state law. So I expect there will need to be some amendments before it actually passes. The law department claims that they meet all state regulations, but once again, the ways in which they violate it are fairly cut and dry. I continue to be concerned with the law department's ability to read and interpret state laws and regulations. They don't have a solid track record. But other than those shortcomings I pointed out, it seems to be pretty solid. They've created a special permit process to where if a homeowner wants to build a second ADU, they can go in front of the city and ask them to vote in support of them building a second ADU, which is cool. Once again, there are a few flaws in this plan, but overall, the state government is forcing Waltham to be a little bit more pro-housing. And even though Waltham is working its hardest to do the bare minimum, the bare minimum is still much better than status quo. So still, I think broadly, good things to come.
Right. Well, thank you, Tom. And moving right along, we have the Veterans Housing Ordinance related to this very same set of things.
Yeah. And this is a very short update because nothing has changed substantially with the Veterans Housing Ordinance. Veterans Housing Ordinance says that Waltham is allowed to require developers to give priority for affordable housing units to veterans for 10 affordable housing units built in any development. Fairly uncontroversial. Also not very impactful. If we want affordable housing built from this, Waltham is going to have to start actually allowing buildings larger than 50 units to generate that affordable housing for veterans. But regardless, non-controversial. It's a law that doesn't actually require building housing. It's a law that allows city councilors to nominally support veterans while doing very little. So it passed no problems. It's in the exact same stage of the voting process as the MBTA Communities Act is, which is to say, City Council has voted in support of it twice, and at the start of next year, they're going to vote on it a 3rd time, which means that it'll then go to the mayor's desk for either her signature or it will sit on her desk for 10 days and then automatically become law.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom. And moving on from housing stuff, we have Saul talking about Moody Street.
Hi. So Moody Street yet again, as well as some of our traffic commission related items. I forget the exact timeline, but the city commissioned a $60 or so thousand engineering study, niche engineering, that has also worked with the city in other projects. I think some traffic light projects, for example. They finished their study back in the fall. It's about a 400-page PDF. The first 60 pages are text and images. The rest is all traffic data that we looked at on a previous episode. So there was a public input session at Government Center Building on School Street on November 21st. It was a very rainy, raw night, but still pretty good attendance. The engineering firm did about a 15-minute slideshow presentation of their study, and then it was open to public input. This was run by the planning department. Robert Waters, who at the time was acting head and now is the head of the planning department, approved last week or so in the city council. Mike Garvin, the traffic engineer, was sitting behind me in the audience, but notably, no one else in the traffic commission was there. Like, this was not a traffic commission meeting. It was not like one of the ones that was held 2 springs or 3 springs ago, where the traffic commission was sitting on the stage. This was solely a planning department session. So pretty much the same thing. I mean, we could play a video from like the 2021 session and you wouldn't know that it was actually the 2021, 22, 23, or 24. Like, everyone is saying the same things, like that they said in 2022 and 2023. Some people like, nope, leave it alone. Some people want more walkability, more bikeability. Nothing, as expected, nothing new came out of this. Like, I seriously doubt that anyone's mind was changed based off of the rhetoric out of that November 21st session.
We did record it though, and I'll try to put a card link in this thing here around now.
Yes, the Waltham channel, notably, was seemingly such an important thing, especially because the mayor, back at the earlier traffic commission, I guess it would have been in September or October, when they decided on this. The mayor was like, "Oh, we need a venue with like lots of microphones and parking," and the Waltham channel was not there recording this, but we were.
And it wasn't a venue that could have recorded, so yeah, I guess it must have been a scheduling conflict.
Yeah, but it is recorded, so thank you for that. We'll provide a link to that. So again, just a recap of what this niche engineering study proposed were 3 alternatives. Basically, 1 and 2 are pretty similar. Allow either northbound traffic only or southbound traffic only, and with more space for wider sidewalks, because now you have 1 fewer lane of car travel. And then option 3 was do nothing. One continual limitation of all this is just framing this as like, cars good, cars bad, do we want to limit cars? And there's no kind of like holistic high level view of maybe we can actually leave traffic both ways, but how can we still make it a more pleasant experience? Do we need parking in every single square foot of space on the curb, for example? Maybe we can allow 2-way traffic, but reduce the number of street parking, but make all of that parking, let's say, handicapped and short-term parking only. Because a lot of the concerns were, well, people have limited mobility. Like, if you cut off street access, like, they can't get to their destination. Well, how about if we have 2-way traffic as we do, but maybe only allow parking on one side, which gives us a lot more space, or maybe kind of parking is staggered. And none of this was explored in this engineering firm, partially because solely because the RFP that the engineering firm was going off of was basically to explore these options. 1-way traffic northbound, 1-way traffic southbound, or do nothing, leave it alone. So kind of the results were just baked into the RFP process in the first place, that the engineering firm was going off of when producing this traffic study. And again, it was solely a traffic study. As we said, of the 400 or so pages, about 340 of those pages are raw traffic data. Like, you may have seen back last April, if you were walking or driving on Moody Street, these these devices on some street like light posts. Those were monitoring all traffic like over a span of X number of hours, 1 day or 2 days. How many cars, how many people, how many bikes, what were the speed of those cars? Did those cars turn? What street did they turn onto? It's like it's a massive amount of data that was accumulated on Adams Street, Crescent Street, Moody Street over the span of several days back in April. But that's what this report was. It was solely a traffic report. So anyway, this session was held on November 21st. The Traffic Commission was not in attendance. Mike Garvin, the traffic engineer, was there, but again, he's not the Traffic Commission, okay? He just advises the Traffic Commission.
He works for them.
Yeah, he reports. The Traffic Commission is pretty much his boss. Like he works under the Traffic Commission. So December 19th, so this was a busy week in city government between the MBTA Communities Act hearings and city council and committees, and then the Traffic Commission that Thursday, December 19th. The same guy who did the presentation at the public session, he did a similar presentation before the Traffic Commission. And again, the whole framing was about just traffic. Where will cars go? Like one thing Clerk Vizard, who's on the Traffic Commission, talks about is, well, if we take cars off Moody Street, well, now they're going on to Adams Street and Lowell Street, and those streets come up every single meeting because drivers are speeding. Like, well, yeah, because you, as the Traffic Commission, refuse to implement traffic calming measures, even though Vizard is one of the more vocal proponents of traffic calming measures, as opposed to some of their members of the Traffic Commission. So yeah, if you're going to frame this as like, if cars don't go on Moody Street, if drivers don't go on Moody, we're just pushing them onto Crescent and Adams and Newton Street and Lowell Street, and now we're just going to have crashes on those streets because drivers are reckless and go fast because we don't do anything to stop them. Yeah, you're setting yourself up to like not ever make any changes. Someone made an argument on the Welfare and Residents Facebook page along the same lines, saying like, well, wouldn't you think of like won't people think of the children? It's like if drivers are like shunted off to Adams Street and Lowell Street where kids are living, and one of those drivers hits like one of those kids, like how are you yourself? Kind of making that argument. It's like, so if you frame this as solely as a traffic study, like you're just dooming yourself never to make any changes. Which again comes back to the kind of more higher level, which should not just apply to Moody Street, but should apply to multiple streets, like every street in the city. How do we strike a better balance between the ability of drivers to go where they want to go, but also the safety, comfort, and convenience of people that are getting around, not by driving. And that's kind of lost in all of this 400 pages of traffic data. Like there are ways that we can allow two-way traffic still on Moody Street. But again, maybe we don't need parking on like every single square inch where drivers can presently park now, when there are 600 plus off-street parking spots. Maybe we reduce the parking on Moody Street, but dedicate that solely again to handicap parking, to short-term parking. That would actually, ironically, also improve traffic flow. One of the biggest impediments to traffic flow on Moody Street is drivers parallel parking. Like every time a driver like parallel parks, that basically stops traffic. Like parallel parking is actually one of the biggest impediments to a smooth traffic flow on Moody Street. So by pushing more drivers into the copious off-street lots, you're actually improving traffic flow if that's your concern on the street. Another argument that kind of has just gotten lost in all of this. Like you can't really have a street that has tons of parallel parking and is also like a major thoroughfare, as some members of the Traffic Commission like to say. Like those two are incompatible.
Yeah, that's the thing that's frustrating about this whole situation is it's like traffic is going to move at the speed of the slowest car in the line, and if you're putting a bunch of parking spaces on your thing where your people are supposed to be moving, they're not going to be moving very fast a lot of the time.
anyway, so at the Traffic Commission meeting on December 19th, so the traffic engineer Garvin recommended that the commission accept the report, okay, just meaning that, okay, we paid for the report, we acknowledge the findings. But then Bob Waters, who again was the former housing director, then acting planning director, now the planning director, made a motion to pretty much table any further discussion, arguing that it's the city council that has to originate any like future plans that the traffic commission can then examine. And that motion passed, meaning that basically nothing further is happening. Like pretty much no one wants to take responsibility for this. It's just a hot potato where the planning department doesn't want it, the council doesn't want it. Like no one wants to take responsibility for like doing something that's going to make some constituents unhappy.
The outcome of this is like it's just going to be waiting until people get annoyed enough that Moody Street isn't happening again next year to then ask people like their electeds why not. And
yeah, it'll be curious what actually happens for the summer of 2025. Like is it just going to be a repeat of last year where restaurants can set up outdoors? Because it's getting to that time of year again. It's usually these discussions usually come up in the February or so, like early spring. Where restaurant owners again need to know, do I need to order this, like, do I need to rent these tables? Do I need to start making staffing plans for expanded seating come Memorial Day weekend? Like, yes, winter just started, but like it's not that far off. Like these discussions usually started happening in March in previous years. So what will again happen this year? Like, is it just nothing's gonna happen this year? I don't know. One thing that did happen was besides the Waltham Times reporting on this, the Globe picked up on this also. I don't know if the reporter was in attendance at any of the meetings, but the Globe wrote an article. The Globe did write an article also last year, last spring. Full disclosure, I was quoted in that article. Jonathan Paz put me in touch with the reporter. The reporter for the article that appeared on the 27th of this month was a different reporter than last year's. But again, the title, and we'll link to it, the very headline of the article was just pitting cars against people. It's like, do we want more cars? Do we want less cars? Cars good, cars bad. None of this discussion about, again, how can we have both like automobile traffic, but also make for a more pleasant environment. One of the more kind of ridiculous ones, I think, the Patel Brothers supermarket, Indian Market, where he made the argument that he's still recovering from pandemic losses, and he's suffering because he gets a lot of new customers who find out about his business from just driving down Moody Street. On many levels, this is a bit ridiculous. First of all, how do you know that? It's like, when I've gone shopping there, the cashier didn't ask me, like, how did you find out about us? And I doubt many customers, when they go to a store, it's like, I was driving down and I saw your storefront and I chose to come in here because of that. Anyone that like walks or drives down Moody Street, the Patel Brothers storefront is probably one of the most bland of any on the street. Like, so the argument that like someone driving from like North Waltham to the Mass Pike in Newton just happened to see this wonderful storefront and decide, I'm going to come back someday and shop at this store. And that's how they found out about this business. Seems a bit suspicious to me. But that was the Patel Brothers owners' chief complaint about making any changes. It's also a bit suspicious because his main competitor is 3 blocks away, the Waltham Indian Market, and they actually took advantage of the outdoor space over the last several seasons, either by having produce outside or I think it was the coconut juice or sugarcane juice.
Yeah, they were pressing sugar, I
something.
believe. But yeah, they
Yeah.
actually like engaged with the event rather than sort of hunkering down. Like,
Yeah, so the notion that someone that was gonna patronize Patel Brothers, and I don't mean to be just picking solely on him, but he chose to go on the record and be quoted in the article, so he's fair game for being criticized. The notion that I was going to go there is instead going to another Patel Brothers in Massachusetts. I don't know if there are others, or going to driving to Alston or Cambridge, or I think Shrewsbury or Worcester might have other Indian markets. Seems a bit dubious, um, as opposed to someone just like parking behind. The article even points out, the owner goes, even though we do have our own parking spots right behind, that's still not enough to counter the losses by drivers not being able to see our storefront. Also, remember last year in the summer of 2024, the street was fully open to traffic, like 24/7 the entirety of the summer. So the notion that he's still losing business because customers from 2 years ago now were not able to find out about his storefront by driving by seems a bit doubtful, but it also just speaks to this whole mindset of probably many business owners who tend to vastly overestimate how many customers find out about them by just driving down a traffic clogged street.
They act as if like car customers are that so much more valuable than like people that are just walking by. But like a lot of people live around there, and like you can like if that's your primary grocery store, you're gonna be going there all the time. And I feel like they much like it's sort of the same perspective of like drive-through restaurants kind of valuing cars way more than anyone walking up, to the point where they don't even allow people to walk up after a certain point, and you only have to come in through a car if it's past a certain hour.
Which some cities, I think Portland, just totally tangentially, I think Portland, Oregon might be a city where that has banned that practice, that if a restaurant is open for a drive-through only, they have to serve walk-up
Yeah.
customers. Totally tangential to our
Yeah.
discussion.
I mean, like honestly, it sort of spoke to the sort of issue that I've seen with a lot of traffic commission stuff, where it's very much like it's like dealing with systemic issues, but then they focus the scope down to something extremely narrow and refuse to discuss anything outside of that scope. And I mean, like part of the issue with like Moody Street is people commuting through it and things like that, and making it a difficult place for people who live in the area to live around.
Yeah, that was another comment someone had made. Because so these comments were all in response to someone posting a link to the Globe article. Um, and yeah, someone else was, yeah, I like we live in North Waltham. My wife like teaches in Auburndale. Like Moody Street is the main north-south corridor. But if you look at the traffic data, like from this study, one thing that it does bring home is that Moody Street is not a major north-south thoroughfare. The average traffic speed during peak commuting times is like 18 miles an hour. Okay, it's not a main, like the traffic, it does not actually get a lot of cars. Okay, because of the very reasons we just discussed. Okay, like traffic is slow moving partially because of people parallel parking, because of people walking. It is just not a major north-south thoroughfare. And if it were a major north-south thoroughfare with fast-moving traffic, like that would actually be really bad for business. Okay, because if drivers were going by, if traffic did allow for like 35, 40 miles an hour on Moody Street, which it does not, okay, no one is going to see your storefront. Like you actually want slower, calm traffic, okay? If you want drivers to be able to actually see your storefronts, as opposed to just like whizzing by like at 30, 40, 50 miles an hour. So we will see what happens. More short term, if anything comes up for outdoor dining. Because as far as I know, that does have to go before the traffic commission. The traffic commission does have jurisdiction over the parking lanes. So if restaurants wanted to set up as they did last year, that would have to go before the traffic commission. So I know in previous years, this all originated from the mayor. Like the mayor saying last year, I will not support setting the street to cars, or this year rather, earlier this year, back in February or so. So we will see if anything similarly comes before the traffic commission in February or March, or whether councilors Logan or Harris bring up an agenda item, since it would be their wards or one of the at-large councilors.
All right. Yeah. So we'll keep you all posted if anything comes up regarding Moody Street before then.
Yes. So in some other items on the traffic commission.
Oh yeah, take it away.
Yeah. So another matter that came up was Councilor LaFosse requesting traffic calming measures on Plympton Street. So Plympton Street is kind of near Leary Field, off of Bacon Street. There was actually a car crash just a few weeks ago, right at the corner of Plimpton and Athletic Field Road and Bacon Street. This intersection has come up several times before. There's a huge tree on the northeast corner of that intersection that not only completely blocks the sidewalk, but also blocks visibility of drivers. And no one has figured out what to do about that. Assuming they want to leave the tree in place because it is a pretty big, majestic tree. So at a previous traffic commission, they decided they were going to augment the existing stop sign on both Plimpton and Athletic Field Road. So they're either side of the street, either side of Bacon, by putting in an overhead, like flashing yellow for Bacon, flashing red for the two side streets. There's something similar to that on Lowell Street near Pine Street, and some other places around the city. But LaFosse, I think, was talking more in general about just Plympton Street as a whole. It's another typical Waltham, relatively wide street. It's downhill in one direction. That leads itself to excessive speeds.
There's a raised table near there, right?
Yeah, on Bacon Street, where it crosses the rail trail, it's a raised crosswalk, just like on Hammond Street and Prospect Hill Road and Lyman Street.
Mm.
And there was the usual pushback, especially from Fire Chief Mullen. Anything that can slow down his fire trucks, he's adamantly opposed to. But then he made a remark that kind of points to a lack of insight into how traffic works. We'll link to the actual clip, but he was like, we hear at every meeting after meeting, like drivers are speeding down my street, like drivers are being reckless on my street. But we also hear meeting after meeting that there's traffic is a nightmare in Waltham. There's gridlock everywhere. Like both of these cannot be true.
We spend half our meetings here complaining about gridlock, and then half our meetings saying everybody's driving too fast. We can't have it both ways. I've said it a lot from the fire chief's position, public safety, that speed bumps and those things are detrimental to our community. And I get, they're done in Somerville. Somerville's 4 square miles. They have 6 fire stations. We have 12 square miles, almost 13, and we have 6 fire stations. So for us to get those response times down, we'd need 12 more fire stations to get that same thing. That's why we're against speed bumps. So I agree that something should be done. We should be looking at what alternatives are available, but I also think that some of these calming measures, it's an enforcement problem and not so much a infrastructure problem.
And the reality is both of those can be true, because what causes gridlock and what causes traffic is not individual streets, it's intersections. Okay, intersections are where traffic happens. Okay, you could have a very free-flowing street, okay, until you reach an intersection, and that becomes the limiting factor in how many cars can get through an intersection. So it's entirely possible to have a street like Plympton Street where drivers are going 40, 45 miles an hour for 10 seconds, okay, which can basically be almost the entire span of the street past 24 people's homes, and then they reach Bacon Street, okay, or they reach a stop sign, or they reach another intersection, and now they stop, okay? So yes, you might have many streets where drivers are going dangerously fast, or where there are limited sight lines, and you could still also have just backups, because it's the intersections that limit throughput in streets. It's not individual streets themselves. Okay, go to any street, okay, and you'll see cars lined up at intersections, okay. That is the limiting factor. So for him to throw out this notion that we can't have the need for traffic calming because traffic is supposedly like awful everywhere in Waltham, just as a fundamental misunderstanding of the way traffic commission works, and kind of just points to a bigger picture of like, we don't have any experts in like actual transportation that are on the traffic commission. Okay, we have the treasurer, we have the fire chief, whose sole goal like is to have his fire trucks go fast. We have the police chief who chairs the traffic commission. again, whose sole goal is to have his police vehicles be able to go fast. Okay, we have the wires department. Okay, Tim Kelly, whose job is just to make sure that we're not like making traffic lights do things they can't do. Like we don't actually have anyone that understands how traffic works other than Mike Garvin. But again, he doesn't have a vote on the traffic.
And it's the whole pattern of like hurry up and wait with it when it comes to cars is just really annoying too. It's like I'll be crossing the street and someone will be mad that they had to stop for the pedestrian and then they peel out away to go wait at a red light just up the street anyway. And then a lot of the road design goes into this too, where it's like you got the roads that are sort of, if you ever are adding lanes or turning lanes and stuff for the cars queuing up at intersections, well then suddenly when it's less trafficy because it's a different time of day, suddenly you have a race course. And that's the problem is that they kind of, if you design for peak demand, it's not always going to be like it's going to be used for other things outside of the peak demand period, I guess. So
Yeah. So I don't know how this changes, but it just again just points to a kind of just high level deficiency in the way the traffic commission is structured. So another kind of similar thing, there was talk about the Maple High Moody intersection across from the expanded firehouse that opened a couple of years ago. That's been on the agenda for a couple of meetings. And a lot of it's been kind of tabled just pending what happens with Moody Street. This came up again at the December 19th Traffic Commission, but the discussion was solely about replacing the traffic lights that are currently on posts with mast arms that are kind of just overhanging the intersection to improve visibility of traffic lights for drivers. There was no talk at all about shrinking that intersection, which has massive crosswalk lanes. Historically, the reason for that, you look at old maps and so Maple Street, which comes from the west, so Prospect Street becomes Maple Street after it crosses Crescent Street at the river. That turns into High Street after it crosses Moody Street. Historically, until about 70 years ago or so, Maple Street and High Street were two separate streets. They did not intersect. Maple Street came in a bit south, High Street was a bit north. That's why when you're kind of driving now and it's one street, there's kind of that turn in the road, okay? And then you have that kind of leftover park space next to Amuletto that's not really used for much these days. Because back sometime in the 50s or so, give or take, I'm gonna guess. I'd have to look at old maps to improve traffic throughput, I assume, so that drivers didn't have to kind of make a left and then make a right. It was turned into one continuous street, which is why you end up with crosswalks that are about 100 feet in length, which is ridiculous for a major like walking route.
there's some really funny crosswalks like that in Waltham where like just walking at a normal pace, I'll start when I hit the crosswalk. So you're getting a countdown. I'll just like barely make it across with a few seconds, and it's like I'm not even a slow walker.
And drivers can still turn right on red in all four right turn motions in that intersection.
Almost been taken out by someone doing that once. It's not great.
Yeah, at Moody and Pine Street, right on red is banned now in all directions. But by the fire station, drivers can turn right on red. There are wide turning radii, which just fosters faster turns, and none of that came up in this discussion. It was all about the placement and phasing of the traffic lights. Yes, so that came up. And then one other thing of note that came up was the car wash on Elm Street next to the train tracks. So, Jamie, if you want to talk about the special permitting process,
Oh, yeah. So I'd been only partially following this process in city council, but basically it looked like the city council has been getting a lot of complaints about the noise, and as a result, was sort of starting to push back on a special permit from that was being held by the car wash for, I think, possible future work that they wanted to do on the place, basically requiring them to be improving their sound damping or else.
Yeah, and there was a public meeting sometime in the fall.
Yeah, I don't have the date, but I think I did record it, so I should be able to link it here. But yeah, it was basically a bunch of residents pointing out just how loud this place was, and there was some.
And the lights also shining
Oh, yeah.
into the relatively new apartment building
Oh, yeah.
diagonally across Elm Street.
And after that happened, there was like a car crash where someone exiting the car wash just went straight into Charles
Into the
afterwards.
embankment.
Yeah. The whole thing is a hazard because there'd also been a crash where one of the cars coming out of the car wash had slammed into the building next door.
Yeah, across Elm Street. Yeah.
And it's so anyway, regardless, their sort of permit was sort of in limbo or not really in limbo, but it was sort of being threatened briefly. I think in the last meeting I went to, I believe it had moved forward at least.
Yeah, so they pushed it to the traffic commission. So
Oh.
the traffic commission was discussing on the December 19th meeting was the concerns about drivers blocking through traffic by queuing up to go into the car wash, which is especially bad because the grade crossing is right there, and you don't want a driver getting stuck on the tracks when the gates come down. So as part of the special permit renewal, the traffic commission agreed that the car wash would need an employee in place to block new customers from coming in
And direct
if
people back.
if the queue is already too long. Well, I could say firsthand this is not working because I was walking to the train on I think it was Monday or Tuesday. It was the sunny day after the snowstorm, and drivers were like, oh, I need to get all the salt off my car. And walking to the train station from the south side, drivers were just queued up on the sidewalk. And we have some pictures I can
yeah.
share.
I took some as well. I was actually driving by in the other direction, and I had to stop at one point at the grade crossing. I was like 2 car lengths from being on the grade crossing, I think. It's just like it doesn't take many cars lined up in front of that car wash to completely block traffic on the
Yeah,
road.
there's not much space to queue cars up, and having drivers block the sidewalk is as bad as having them block other drivers.
And,
Given that it's a walking route right to buses and the train.
and actually related to this, just to piggyback on, but the car wash didn't have their sidewalks shoveled, but also like many other commercial or like businesses and in multi-unit like apartment buildings didn't have it shoveled either per our city ordinance, or I think it's resolution, so it might not be that enforceable, but either way.
Well, the ordinance is that 3 and higher units have to clear.
Yeah.
Single and 2 family don't. They can build an ADU now, but they don't have to shovel their sidewalks.
Yep. I took a few photos along River Street of like people that had done that, and like one of the worst examples was that on the intersection of River Street and Newton Street, the Connors Pool wasn't shoveled at all, the entire sidewalk, which is city property. And neither was the parking lot just up River Street. And then,
Yeah, the Moody Street Bridge on Monday Monday evening was a sheet of ice still. So I don't know if it's just the first storm and kind of CPW dropped the ball. I don't know if it's because it was during a holiday break when schools were out, but city-owned properties will be better
yeah,
plowed.
hopefully they at least get the memo when it comes to this kind of thing, because that was not great.
Yeah, so that's all I have for traffic commission
Awesome.
related items.
I had one remaining thing that kind of came up right at the end of city council this last session, and that was the dumpster ordinance, which we've kind of been following throughout the process. And that was kind of originally related to a lot of complaints about rats in the city and general sort of food not being taken care of properly. And this had the rather than materializing anything addressing the like individual garbage units, the councilors Logan and Harris have opted to push for going after the restaurant garbage and sort of larger unit garbage. So basically anywhere that has a dumpster, they wanted to get the city health inspector basically to be charging them like a fee for operation per dumpster. And so some of these companies would have then ended up paying a bunch of fees for operation. So the idea being then that they could use that sort of relationship that was then created to then have a reason to then, or have a thing to withhold if there was an issue with the dumpster. And that was sort of moving along and was set to get voted on at the last city council of the year, but that ended up getting tabled by Brasco. And he was citing kind of the issue that I think a lot of us have with transparency of having something sort of get rammed through in the committee council where it doesn't really get fully discussed in a proper view of the public. So I can't say I blame him for that one.
They won't have that. So what we're doing right now is we're voting on amendments. We're voting on these issues when we're getting Reader's Digest versions of what is actually taking place in the committee tonight. So with all due respect to the committee, we're being forced, with the attorneys representing, you know, what amendments have been proposed, we now have to say, we're ready to go. This is urgent. This needs to be done before 2025. The reason why we've had these meetings, committee council, is usually for urgent matters, to address the needs that weren't taken care of so that we could do things efficiently. This is not efficient tonight. This is cramming through stuff that I think that we haven't had a chance to digest. So right now, the first vote we took, I was even perplexed. So I actually was in favor of it, but I voted against it. I just voted in favor of the minor modification because I'm in favor of it, but I haven't had time to review what was done in the committee. I know that it's going to go out for a public hearing, so we'll have the time to debate and deliberate, which is the way that it should work. We shouldn't be cramming through things at the last minute at 11 o'clock on December 22nd, right before Christmas, so that we can say that we got things done. So now, with this issue, I'm going to make a motion to table on the city council floor.
Non-debatable.
And some of the other concerns I saw being raised were from sort of people on the more small business owner side, talking to Councilor LaCava about issues with like what the price of this might end up being for people that have businesses that rely on having a dumpster behind them.
And that I think just definitely fell upon deaf ears is the fees. 8-175, $100 fee, roughly 2,000 to 3,000 dumps in the city. We have dumpsters, companies that have upwards of 600 dumpsters in the city. We're going to be asking them for $60,000 checks up front, and they're going to be coming back at the end user for this money, along with a lot of paperwork that their administrators are going to have to do. If we're going to pretend that we think it's only a $100 fee added on to the end user, I suggest, or I ask you to get involved in the real world a little bit more, because the end user is going to be seeing $200, $300, $400 end costs on this at a bare minimum.
So, and I think there was also some issues that he saw as not particularly helpful that were being legislated in, like requirements to have like visual barriers around dumpsters, which wouldn't actually improve the rat situation. It would probably make it easier for rats to access. So
this ordinance really doesn't do anything to stop the rats, other than one item that was added to section 8.178 20 minutes before this meeting, which include a pest control program to be added for every dumpster in the city. A pest control program that would, of course, come at quite a cost. Section 8.8-179 in this ordinance, it talks about screening and fencing requirements. I had a lot of concerns about it, and it seems like the language just became even more broad, stating the Board of Health may require the dumpsters governed by this article, other than temporary dumpsters, be screened or fenced off from view from public ways, sidewalks, and adjoining properties. Again, does absolutely nothing for rats. If anything, we know fencing helps harbor rats, leaves, debris gets tucked in here, and off we go with more rats.
I'm hoping they discuss this thing further, but either way, that's going to be happening sometime next year. So I think that sounds like it's all we've got for the year of 2024. I'll catch you all in 2025.
Yeah, new year. Let's go.
All right. Happy New Year, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.